And joining me now is Mark Toth, co-founder of Intrep 360. Good evening to you, sir.
Good evening, Aaron. Great to be back on with you.
A pleasure to have you with us. I want to start with Poland. The Pentagon has suddenly slashed the deployment of 4,000 troops. Warsaw insists this is just logistical. There's also the 5,000 troop drawdown in Germany, which of course creates all sorts of uncertainty over where they will go. But Mark, at the end of the day, is this a death knell for Europe's confidence and faith in security guarantees from Washington?
Aaron, it's a great question because it could be. If Europe panics and looks at this in the short term, then yes, it could rattle Brussels to its core, but it shouldn't. What the U.S. is doing here, in my opinion, is not acceptable. This is not the way we should be treating our NATO allies, but there is a message behind it. As horrible as the way that Trump is trying to do this, which is to get Europe to do more. So I think the key here, if the cooler heads are going to prevail, especially in Europe, is for how Europe reacts to this. Instead of getting focused on the United States, which is probably what Trump and Hesketh wants Europe to do, focus on your own response to say, okay, we're going to step it up. And in Poland, your country is in the best position to do that because you've been taking the lead all along. Your 4.7% GDP defense spending, the fact that Trump himself has called you that model ally that the U.S. wants to see in NATO. So I think this is an opportunity for Europe to say, okay, challenge accepted. We don't like the way that you're doing it, but we're not going to be cowed by it, and the Russian threat is not going to go away. So let's start rolling up our sleeves and getting to work.
You mentioned model ally. I want to ask you about that because Poland continues to be the most stable American ally in Europe. Those were the reported words of the Polish Defence Minister Władysław Koźmiak-Kamysz as recently as Friday. How blindsiding is this for officials in Warsaw who believe that President Trump calling the country a model ally actually stands for something?
Yeah, Aaron, I can honestly say if someone had asked me to assess, in my capacity of writing on U.S. national security and foreign policy, I too would argue that Poland has been the definitive model ally in Europe, not just Eastern Europe, but I would say all of Europe and the leadership role that you've taken. I would also add the other Baltic states because I think your country, like them, understands what it's like to live, under Russian repression or Soviet repression as it was during the Cold War, and that there just cannot be a return to that. In terms of Poland being blindsided, I think that's a fair assessment to make because there's nothing that Poland has done over the course of Trump's presidency, and indeed nothing that Poland has done since the beginning of the war in Ukraine in 2022 that deserves being blindsided in this way. And many members of Congress are feeling that same pain. You have people like Representative John Bacon, an arch supporter of Ukraine and Europe and Poland itself, someone who used to be a brigadier general and was at Ramstein, I believe, in command of U.S. forces there decades ago, are all coming out and saying we all feel blindsided. So I don't think Poland should be ashamed in saying that they're blindsided. I think it's an important message to get out to your own people, but also to those of your allies in the United States, because this approach by Hesketh about coordinating more closely with Warsaw is just unacceptable. Blindsiding is a great way to describe it. I was blindsided by it.
You rightly point out Poland is a country that does almost everything Washington asks. It spends more than almost any other member state on defence. It buys American equipment at scale. Is Vladimir Putin sitting in the Kremlin right now and thanking his lucky stars for a gift from the White House?
Yeah, Aaron, clearly, Vladimir Putin is a man who is down on his luck at this point in time. He needed this. It's like a shot in the dark for him. Because if you saw him at the victory parade, this was a man who looked very solemn, downcast, not someone who looked like his armies were marching to victory in Ukraine. And the parade itself proved that. No military hardware, a far cry from the heydays of the Soviet era, where the parade route along the Kremlin just lit up the sky with different types of massive Soviet armaments, nuclear weapons, etc. That wasn't anywhere to be seen. And Putin is scrambling right now. I mean, he's marching off quickly to Beijing to have his own state visit with Chinese President Xi Jinping in the aftermath of Trump's summit. And Putin is trying to find relevancy again. And to some extent, Trump just gave him some because he's, giving him breathing room in Eastern Europe, where now is the time, in my opinion, that the U.S. should be taking advantage of this, leverage this, put more troops into Poland, solidify the working relationship with Ukraine, because Ukraine really is the protectorate at this point of Eastern Europe. It's that dagger that would be pointing at Russia, were they foolish enough, along with Belarus, to invade Poland or the Baltic states. It's a gift to Putin. Thankfully, if we look at it at a macro level, though, or a high altitude, Putin's just not much, doesn't have much opportunity to take advantage of it. Europe can and still should.
Speaking of breathing room for Russia, I guess it all comes down to this question of trust, right? Can Europe really trust that America will back up and honour NATO's Article 5, this clause that says an attack on one is an attack on all if Russia comes across the border of the alliance, whether in Poland, whether in the Baltics, the Nordics? Or, Mark, is that now plainly wishful thinking?
I don't. I do believe the United States, at the end of the day, especially because it would become a political issue in Congress, Trump, whether he wanted to or not, would be forced to back up Article 5 if the Russians invaded, or it became imperative for that to happen to secure U.S. interests, not just military interests, but economic interests as well.
Mark,
if I can play a little bit of devil.
What about, Mark, what about an incursion into the Baltics, an attack that is in NATO territory, but it's not a whole-scale invasion? Do you think Donald Trump would come to Europe's aid then too?
I think eventually he'd be politically forced to, because his generals would be saying, look, if we don't do this now, then we're giving this huge green light to Russia to act in the future. And it is a plausible scenario, because certainly, Putin looking for an out in Ukraine could say, hey, maybe I'll try to launch something, in the Baltic states, for instance, go after the key Suwalki Gap that divides your country with Lithuania and Belarus. I think that's something that Putin could try. Will he do it? I doubt it.
More broadly, in the event of a Kremlin attack, the bigger question as well is Europe ready to defend itself right now without American troops? Does it still need to keep Washington happy, even in this situation, because some soldiers are better than none at all?
Yeah, Aaron, and I think your question just before that is a good prelude to answering this one. I think trust has to be reestablished on both sides of the Atlantic. If I can play devil's advocate for a quick second here, Europe isn't trusting the U.S. right now to come to its aid. And after the fiasco, whether Europe agreed with it or not, in Iran, trust is saying, look, we don't trust you to have our backs. We have all of this military commitment. We pre-station troops forward, along with the logistics that go with it, throughout Europe, especially in Germany. And you guys weren't there, especially Italy, Spain, in his mind, and the UK and Germany, when we needed you most to facilitate U.S. military operations in Iran. So I think from that standpoint, it's critical that that trust gets reestablished. And as I keep saying here on TVP World, let cooler heads prevail and get that back together. In my opinion, at this point, Europe is not for lack of trying, but Europe is not yet ready to fight this battle on its own. That's why it's critical to get this relationship right. You simply don't have the satellite spread that's necessary. The U.S. has several hundred military satellites. Europe has less than a handful that would be needed in any kind of war against Russia, were they to invade. You don't have the logistics, the command and control yet that's still needed to tightly operate these different groups. And that's why it's disappointing. Interoperability is such a key strength of NATO. And that's why, Trump pulling the 2nd Armored Brigade from coming, or the 3rd Battalion, the 2nd or the latter, that is a long fires operation. You lose that interoperability training that's so key if the Soviets were, sorry, I don't know why I have the Soviets on my mind today, but if the Russians were to invade, you lose that. So I think Europe, it's to their benefit, move faster, accelerate where you need to in terms of making up these shortages, but you're not going to get there in a year or two. That's why the U.S. and NATO has got to get on the same page again. This is not one we can afford to be going separate ways.
You hinted at the flip side there, and of course at the re-establishing of trust. I quote, In Europe and other theatres, allies will take the lead against threats that are less severe for us, but more so for them, with critical but more limited support from the United States. You'll probably recall that because that was the Pentagon's National Defence Strategy released earlier this year. So maybe this all wasn't so unexpected. Did Europe, did Poland simply fail to read the writing on the wall?
Right. I think oftentimes when we look at the national defense strategy, it's a long-range plan, but the devil comes in the details, and we were waiting for that. I really do think this current crisis, if you will, of confidence in each other, though, does stems from Europe's decision. And again, it's up to Europe to decide for itself over its, not being prepared to support President Trump and his military operations in Ukraine. That's why this is surface now and why it's bubbling over. And I think this is, unfortunately, because again, I don't think it's justified, but I think we're seeing petulance from the Pentagon in doing these moves because they make no long-term military sense. They hurt U.S. preparedness and Europe's preparedness in the event of future war with Russia. And so, yeah, you're correct. The blueprint for this was in the national security strategy, but it was also a call to arms, a call to action. But here's the problem I have with it. In terms of you being completely correct, I'd argue not, because simply Poland, the Baltic states, the new members of NATO, if you will, did take it seriously, and you have stepped up to the plate. This is not the way to reward you. You've done everything that the National Security Strategy has called for. Why go about it this way? Why stop these troops rotating through Poland? Not a good thing.
Now, Mark, we're running out of time, but very briefly, President Putin, we mentioned him earlier. We've seen days of brutal Russian attacks in Ukraine, killing dozens, including children. Is President Putin showing us what he means when he says the war is coming to an end? That for him, that means doubling down.
Right. I don't believe for a minute that Putin is ready to concede to Ukraine, let alone to Europe on this. It was his message of saying the war that continues. But it's a message of desperation because, look, if you look at the target sets that he focused in on, they were largely, a third of them were in residential apartment buildings. Why do that? It doesn't serve you any long-term military purpose other than to terrorize a population that has proven for 4+ years now that you can't terrorize them. They're going to stay in the fight. He's not achieving anything effectively militarily on the battlefield. And yet, when you look at the counterstrikes that Ukraine did, they're taking out air defenses, taking out oil refineries again. They're doing the things that are actually hurting Russia's ability to fight. Putin's armed forces aren't doing that. If I were in Russia, I'd be going crazy because they're not fighting a war. They're fighting a terror campaign. Dumb strategy.
Mark Toth, co-founder of Intrep 360. Always a pleasure to have you on World News tonight. Thank you again for your time.
Pleasure, and good evening to your viewers. Thank you.
And that is World News tonight. Do stay with us here on TVP World for more news and analysis. I'm Dahmen. Good night.